welcome back. In this, we continue with two speakers now, both from Stony Brook. Professor Eric Soloff, graduated from this prestigious institution in 1995. You want me to tell you graduated?
I've not attended 65 or something.
No. 1985, Professor Paul Gutenberg. So
I finished my dissertation very quickly. Without all those ponderous footnotes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I did not want to miss this for anything. And unfortunately, I did end up missing the first panel by my close friends and colleagues of my cohort, but that was because of United Airlines, nothing to do with me. So that was sad for me, but I'm glad to be here for the rest of it. And so I guess I missed the overall tone from the first presentation too, so hopefully this more or less conforms with what people have been discussing, and I suspect some of this is going to be layering onto what people have been talking about. But what I thought I would do is to some degree give a kind of personal narrative and fold it into my time here. I took a rather unusual route to the Chicago PhD, as Niels Jacobsen had brought up, and I was going to, in fact, mention this myself, because I really came here for this double MA. There was an MA at the time. You could get a double MA for one thesis, and I said, what a bargain. It was in International Relations and Latin American Studies, and I came here for that. It was the only program that I applied to in the country. I had no idea about higher education, postgraduate education. I remember I took my GREs in Mexico City, studying for them on the train. I had spent the year previous to coming here traveling around Mexico and Central America, hitchhiking and taking trains around and just immersing myself in politics. I thought I was going to go into journalism or something like that. I really had absolutely no idea. And when I had no idea what I was getting into, put it that way. I didn't understand what University of Chicago was. Unlike, today, it's funny, you see how overly researched students are when they apply to schools, and maybe that's a product of our own neoliberal era. You have to know where your money's going to. Back then, I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into. Didn't know who John or Friedrich were. I didn't come to study with them. I came to do this 2-for-1 MA, basically. When I came to Chicago, I was at that point very steeped in sort of two sets of experiences and observations about Mexican society and politics. I actually knew Mexico fairly well by then, not only because of this previous year's travel on my own, but I'd studied there, lived there as an undergraduate for a period, and had spent repeated summers going back. I was very brought into Mexican culture. And two things stood out for me. One was this, in the 1980s, sort of early to mid-80s, this emergent sort of punk scene, urban punk rock scene. It was in the context of the terremoto in Mexico. And I was just very sort of fascinated, what is punk doing in Mexico? Why are they listening to, my music? There was like the Hora de los Beatles, and I just, people were asking me to translate Dust in the Wind. You were hearing it on all the peceros in Mexico City, and it was just like, what's going on? Why do they care about my music, or what I thought was my music? So I was just very intrigued by whatever that was, that phenomena. And also I was very intrigued, and this gets back to this conversation this morning about the context, the historical context, which very much affected, I think, my cohort, which was of Central America. So Mexico, of course, was pushing the Contadora peace process, and as an undergraduate, right, I couldn't understand, or I was very intrigued by this kind of contradictory complexity of the U.S.-Mexican relationship, that here, Mexico is the U.S. ally, Mexico's sort of saying no to the United States, and it didn't make sense to me. I was trying to understand it, and I did, in fact, write two rather messy undergraduate theses examining both of these issues, the international relations one of the Contadora, and then as a longer undergraduate honors thesis about this idea of the Mexican counterculture. And at the time, as an undergraduate at Colby College, which had no Latin American studies program to speak of at the time. Ben Falal, who's not here unfortunately, is now helping to build up that program, has done a great job. He was also one of our cohort. But at the time, no one could really help me on this. I was working with the US historians at Colby, and I don't know if it was their idea or maybe my idea, my initiative, but I went and somehow found the names of about 10 scholars of Mexico and sent letters to them asking them if they knew anything about the idea of the Mexican counterculture, which was a kind of a strange question to ask, in the 1960s. And I remember no one wrote back to me except for this guy who actually I had forgotten who it was, meant nothing to me at the time, but turned out later to have been John Coatsworth. And the only reason that I remembered even this whole experience was because later when I did come here, for the MA still, I think it must have been part of that. I had some sort of partial fellowship, and I was a research assistant for him, and he had me organizing his, those filing cabinets, if anyone remembers those. And, John is the consummate organizer, saver. As I'm putting away other documents, I see this folder that says Eric Zolov. I'm like, what the hell is this? He's got a dossier on me, and I open it up, and there's this letter from me to John, about this. And then I remembered that it was John, who had in fact responded to me. And he was, I really remember you were the only one who actually answered me. John didn't know anything about the topic, but he must have been intrigued in some ways, certainly very gracious and responsive. And he pointed me towards Evelyn Stevens, who wrote that book, Protest and Response. And it was because of that I actually did track down Evelyn Stevens as an undergraduate and had a bit of a correspondence with her. So that was perhaps John's first and last direct connection with the counterculture per se, but I was later very struck by that, and I think in so many ways helps to exemplify the kind of environment that was created here. So I came to Chicago. I would say steeped in the questions about culture and international relations, but very little, zero conceptual framework about how to make sense of them. So what was it like to study here with John Friedrich during this time? Well, for one, the beauty of the program, and I think this has been discussed elsewhere, is that they gave us so much latitude. They just, if they felt that you had a good idea, they let you run with it. And they would not judge you or rein you in. They would ask you questions that just kept pushing you. You had to defend what you were doing based upon the questions they would ask you. And so they would, I felt at least very sort of pushed to sort of defend or figure out what I was doing. There were always on both parts, very penetrating questions that would force you to sort of defend what it is you were doing, but at the same time, they just gave you tremendous latitude to kind of run with it. If they believed in you, they let you run with it. At the time, the only thing I was really interested in terms of what motivated me, in terms of my own questioning, was figuring out what these punks were doing in Mexico. It just didn't make sense to me. And it came at a moment of, this shift in the social sciences and the idea of cultural hybridity, and Arjuna Potterai was, beginning to write about this idea of transnational flows. And I began at Chicago to find a conceptual theoretical framework that would allow me to make sense of this sort of phenomena, right, that I had witnessed, and that helped me to begin to make sense of it. But the 60s as such, and certainly 68, it was not history, right? It was not considered history. And so I always felt a bit of an outlier in that regard, looking at the 60s, much less looking at the idea of some sort of urban popular culture. And I think I was able to maybe make some more sense of it because I was coming from this MA program in Latin American Studies and International Relations, and so I guess perhaps I felt that I had a little bit of a different angle or ability to defend more contemporary history, because that's what it was. But what I was determined to do was to historicize 68, to historicize the 60s. And in fact, it's funny because I was thinking about it and putting together these notes. I never asked John or Friedrich about their own place in the 60s, even though clearly they were, John I know was there in 68, right? And years later I always kind of regretted, like, why didn't I do that? And I think at some level perhaps I was apprehensive about allowing this period to not become historical. I was very determined, maybe just intuitively, rather than an explicit methodological way, to find the documents, to try to make this history, to not get it bound up in something more too close, because that was always something I wrestled with. Was this, in fact, historical? I want to say a couple of things about what they did, their influence. But before, I want to bring up another issue about context, which I think really affected my cohort and allowed me certainly to figure things out in our own way. One had to do with the broader historical context, which is the fall of communism. I mean, that was just huge here. And, so I entered the program in '88. And I finished my MAs, my 2 MAs for the price of one in '90, and then entered the PhD in 1990, '91. And I just remember all these IR people walking around talking about the Soviet Union and, all this strategizing and all this stuff. And then, one day or the next, that was all gone, and they were just, and everyone's like, no one predicted it, right? It was all about the social science models being able to predict things, and suddenly they couldn't predict it. And I guess in some sense we legitimized, the historian's role of like, hey, history's a funny thing, right? Maybe there is, contingency, and we don't know necessarily the outcome. And I think that really, helped to propel a certain kind of dialogue, again, between the IR people and the history, or at least debates and trying to wrestle with how do we make sense of the world, of history, of these big movements. It really felt like we were in a very momentous period in history, which we were. For so many reasons, right? Because of the end of the Cold War and what was happening in Central America. But the second thing had to do with more local context, and that was the very conservative nature of the law school and the economics program at Chicago. And I remember that there was this very conservative student-run newspaper that was the counterpart to the regular newspaper. And it was really a vehicle for the conservative students to write, and there were just really great debates that would take place. I mean, this was a place that you had to defend your ideas, and I always came to value that, the ways in which you had to defend yourself here, both if you were taking a progressive side or a Marxist side, what have you, and if you were taking the more conservative side. And one event that John organized, and it'd be interesting to hear the genesis of the event, and I'm sure many people were here, was the reunion of Los Chicago Boys, which must have been about, probably around the fall of Pinochet, I guess, when he got knocked out, by '88, '89 maybe, bringing back the University of Chicago trained economists to defend their case. And I remember that was a really contentious space, and very real, right? The reality of applying ideas to the making of history. So just I want to say something about Friedrich, something about John, and then sort of what I'm doing now. So what I got from Friedrich, yeah, great, I can do that. What I got from Friedrich was, and I'm sure others have said this, but the idea, the transnationalization of context. The local is always global. And the way in which he did that without theory, but just making us figure things out. And something, and Deborah Cohen, who's here, we were in seminar together with him, and we took this seminar. It was his Intellectuals in the Mexican Revolution, and I was, here we were at Chicago. I was like, oh great, we're going to read like Gramsci and all this stuff, and nothing. There was no theory at all, and I'm thinking like, where's the theory? How are we going to get this theory? And it was all based, in figuring things out on our own. It was a much more organic understanding of what theory was, and he had this great line that I've come to use in my own teaching. I love it. He'd ask a question, and we'd all sit there kind of dumbfounded, and someone would start like opening the book and flipping through in the books, and he'd say, and it's not on page 234, or something like that, meaning that we're not going to find the answer somewhere. We're going to have to just, figure this out. And he really, forced you to grapple with the logical connections between the local historical actor and the broader historical framework. And it really shaped my understanding of how to understand nationalism as always a product of this global engagement, right? So I really am indebted to Friedrich for that. For John, you know, I always felt he seemed a bit bemused by my topic. And I remember one conversation going in, and I wanted to do a sort of a readings course or something with him on the middle classes, because somehow already I was sort of grappling with this idea that the middle classes were important. And of course, no one here was studying the middle classes, right? Everyone was doing, you know, the peasantry or the elites, you know, in the 19th century or something else. But that was later. No, but you came later, Pablo. You came after me, actually, right? So I just remember John said to me, he said, you know, thing with the middle classes, and I think you were quoting Trotsky at this point, but you said, you know, Trotsky says the middle classes can never make up their minds. They're always flipping around, and they don't know which side to support. And I remember I thought he was just going to endorse this, you know, readings list, and he was kind of like, you know, forced me to defend the logic and explain the logic of the middle class as a social actor. And it was an example of, you know, the kind of probing of pushing you to kind of defend your case. Not to say don't do it, bad idea, but to defend the case. And I really took away from that. And one other thing I really want to emphasize about John is his, you know, rigorous insistence that everything was connected to a power dynamic. And as it was said before, this was the moment when, you know, the cultural turn hit the university, hit the social sciences, like a tsunami, someone said, and it was very fashionable and very appealing. And you know, one thing that, you know, we did in this program at least, and John, was, you know, to really, you couldn't just study culture in an amorphous way. You had to really understand how it was linked to questions of power and political economy. And I'm over. And I want to say an anecdote about this, because there was the seminar with Valencia Mallon came to town, and some people were probably here at that seminar. And she was working, I guess, on this Peasant and Nation book. And, you know, here was Florencia Mallon, you know, as such, in this Latin American workshop, and talking about the whole cultural thing that she was doing there. And I remember John just graciously, as he would, tore her apart piece by piece. And I remember being stunned, her argument. I remember being stunned. I remember being so stunned and so shaped by that encounter. And one thing that, you know, in that broader context that I always gained from him, and I think Aldo brought to was the idea of counting. You know, talk about trying to count, right? So I was doing rock music ultimately, and I counted record albums. Anything I could possibly count, I counted, because, you know, you knew that you had to add things up. You know, there had to be a kind of I don't know, a material basis, right, for these kind of cultural arguments. So that's what I got just from this period. Chicago itself gave me the context to analyze consumption. Wonderful workshops at the workshop. The mass culture workshop was very important for me, by the late Miriam Hansen. I was the lone historian amongst literary folks, all the folks from the English department and what comparative literature and whatnot. And that was another branch, you know, along with anthropology and international relations. So I was going to say something about my current project, which is Mexico in the Global 60s, which in so many ways is even more indebted to Friedrich, in international diplomatic history. I mean, he taught us to go to lots of archives, do as many different archival and especially international diplomatic archival perspectives as possible. And I feel this project that I'm working on now is really sort of closer to the spirit in many ways of what I got from him and from the Secret War and so forth, which we were in the seminar at that moment, than anything I did previously. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Just for the discussion period, I want to pose a question to my esteemed colleague from Stony Brook, which is, what exactly are the lyrics to Dust in the Wind? Anyway, those of you in the morning, we were grappling here with the question of, is there or was there a Chicago school? In the afternoon, I guess the theme is there a Stony Brook school of Latin American history? And the answer is decidedly yes. Stony Brook is the place where they happily exile those of us who pick up really, really quirky topics here, such as guano, rock and roll, and cocaine. Anyway, I do have a talk here, which is entitled Why I Am Not a Mexicanist, or Friedrich and Me. During my graduate training at both Chicago and Oxford, 1979 to 85, I was extraordinarily fortunate to work with three of the era's most remarkable thinkers about Latin America: Friedrich Katz, Rosemary Thorpe, and John Coatsworth, all three of them, in their own ways, inspiring human beings as well. I like the idea of Katzworthian years, for the collegial community that John and Friedrich fostered at Chicago through their wonderful friendships and intellectual synergy with students was palpable at the time. But I will focus here mainly on the imprint of Friedrich Katz on my subsequent scholarship. John will have to do another one of these, the Coates-Katz years, later. Friedrich, in his seminars or conversations about our research, was by no means a methodologist or theorist in today's overuse of such terms. He taught by example, by the penetrating questions he asked about a paper or a thesis, and by the example of his own brilliant work, which we read religiously. His influence grew almost unconsciously, subcutaneously. Years later, you'd find yourself thinking out loud in Katzian terms, or writing something that clearly carried his weight. We had all heard that he was some kind of non-dogmatic European Marxist, but beyond that, his mind was difficult to categorize, and not because it swayed with international fads. In Hyde Park of that era, mainly abstruse thinkers like Althusser and Poulancis. Now, paradoxically, in my case, while John and Rosemary, the Oxford economist, actually did impart explicit models and methods, a few of which I actually absorbed, and spent far more time with me as a student, Friedrich ended up having the largest impact on my life scholarship. And I think that I'm going to give a little bit of what I think here is a Katzian perspective, although these elements have been coming up in other people's talks as well. Now, to me, a Katzian perspective has several key elements. It is relentlessly comparative at both the micro, individuals, and macro, social or global levels. It insists on linking the social, for example, how social movements mobilize people and resources, to the political, leaders, ideologies, the state, and connecting the regional, a place like Chihuahua, to competing world-scale actors and influences. The global was diverse and played more proactive roles than mere historical context or background. Yet he was also sensate to how individuals, from an anonymous peon to a statesman like Carranza, exercise agency and are themselves impacted by larger structures. Now, my scare quotes aside, there was nothing arid or abstract about this. In fact, Katz's forte was intensive archival research, driven, enlivened by very lucid historical questions. Now, I, for one, tried to conceive of his work in sociological terms. For example, his affinity with Tilley's social mobilization theories or Skocpol's models of international revolutions. In many ways, he imparted avant la lettre what later became known among Latin Americanists as the new political history, along with the now trendy transnational history, though I hate to reduce him to anything formulaic. Katz remains inimical because of the seamless and complex ways he wove such modes of thinking into historical narratives of analytical power. Now, the sardonic title, Why I Am Not a Mexicanist. Friedrich, and John as well, was such a born comparativist that he didn't care one whit if I were a Mexicanist at this time when Chicago was starting to lure every would-be young Mexico scholar in the world. No doubt my decision to study the Andes instead, though I admit in a not-so-Andeanist way, was influenced by my contrarian refusal to follow the crowd, in that classic Marxian sense, Groucho's, of whatever it is, I'm against it. Mexico, I felt, was being amply researched. My daughter would understand that reference. Mexico, I felt, was being amply researched, but sorely needed comparisons. In the 1970s, a comparable place like Peru had next to no modern archival research, a dearth, by the way, that no longer holds. My self-styled non-Mexicanist stance began with a 1978 Chicago BA's honors thesis about 19th century Peru, which I discovered when putting together this paper Friedrich had officially read. leaving some encouraging comments. So the two of them enabled the comparativists here at Chicago. After a bucolic 2-year interlude at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, I returned to the less idyllic south side of Chicago, and in a painful burst of writing, finished my third, this time PhD thesis, about Peru in 1985. I have since published a series of obscure books about the Andes, which I'd like to unpack here in terms of Friedrich's mark. Now, my first book, a sort of dense historical sociology, which was wrung from the research base of my Chicago thesis, was called Between Silver and Guano, Commercial Policy and the State in Post-Independence Peru, Princeton, 1989. Notice the footnotes. Although John had lured me towards social sciencey economic history, in retrospect, I see how Friedrich's interpretive secret war in Mexico permeated my entire analysis. My book revolved around a series of international commercial and political rivalries, Britain, the United States, France, Chile, that deeply affected how early Republican Peruvians, including their caudillo political class, mobilized themselves for national politics and ultimately mid-century state formation. It brought a swarm of diplomatic, social, fiscal, and regional actors, elite and subaltern, into the murky processes of Peruvian state formation. At the time, I thought I was simply providing an archival complexity or challenge to then reigning Latin American dependency theory, which is a topic that I'm surprised hasn't come up here in terms of the ambience of Chicago around that time. Now I see Friedrich's profound influence in how I situated the problem of the book at the strategic interstices of the international and the social. And just as in The Secret War, where Carranza paradoxically ends up a confirmed nationalist due to US meddling in the revolution, I found these petty trade interventions spurred a paradox-laden yet ever stronger Peruvian sovereignty. Now, after a second book about Peru, Imagining Development, which nobody I know of read, I turned in the mid-1990s, no doubt in a desperate ploy for attention, to the history of drugs, specifically Andean cocaine. Interestingly, Friedrich would frequently ask me about this research. Given his sobriety, I have to assume his fascination was not with this party drug, but the well-known Austrian Jewish role in its history, that is, Sigmund Freud and his medical circle. While I thought I was drawing on new interdisciplinary currents of commodity history and globalization thought, my ultimate book about this drug, Andean Cocaine, The Making of a Global Drug, footnote, UNC Press, 2009, in the end, has a distinctly Katz feel to it, even in its excessive length and detail. Andean cocaine is structured around a long series of global currents, networks, and rivalries conceived as commodity chains, starting in the mid-19th century, that prompted Peruvians and others to actively join in the expansion of the drug's commerce. I built the book as both a global and local history, not in any comprehensive sense, but as a last-ditch strategy, so-called global history, to make sense of the wild trove of international archives I had found on cocaine. Long political struggles and the forgotten innovation and agency of peripheral actors, I argued, are the hidden story of how cocaine arose as a global drug. First, during the 19th century as a Peruvian nationalist miracle good, and in the 20th century as a menacing world pariah drug. The high Amazonian cocaine territory of Huánuco is the book's Chihuahua, the cradle of cocaine, were consolidated as a modern commodity in the 1880s and was reborn as an illicit one after the 1940s. The range of outside forces implicated in Peruvian cocaine was a truly Katzian cast. Germans, Austrians, Frenchmen, Corsicans, Croats, Brits, and the increasingly imperial Americans, as well as Bolivians, Cubans, Chileans, Colombians, and even some Mexicans, a connection to drugs which in recent times has spawned such horrific social violence, the gravest since the revolution, mostly in Katz's northern borderlands. Andean cocaine even had its own paradoxical secret war within, a covert Cold War US campaign uncovered in declassified intelligence archives to stamp out nascent illicit coke during the 1950s and to 70s, which ironically, in my estimation, only worked to bring on the drug boom of the 1980s. I gave Friedrich one of my first copies of Andean Cocaine, and he was still curious about the book's impact, not much, when I last talked with him in the hospital in September of 2010. Writing this essay has revealed to me just how much Friedrich Katz, in almost subliminal fashion, has guided my historical thinking and writings over 3 decades. I know why, too. His way of thinking, which cannot be bottled, branded, or labeled, is simply enduring. But I miss him, the man, dearly.
So, questions, comments? Professor Rodriguez?
I have a question. One of the great things about your work, not just what your work, Bill or Libby's work, or there's work, is the fact that the language cannot be dated. I mean, it's work that I can assign to an undergrad, that I can read myself. There's work from the 1990s and 80s that you can tell from the 80s and 90s. Your work, for example, I can assign the chapter on gender to people who study culture. And I cannot assign cultural studies from the 1990s to undergrads. So I wonder, how was this a conscious effort of Friedrich Katz and John Coatsworth to shape your work in a way that it transcends trends, but that, for example, transnational historians can read Friedrich Katz and they can hold on to it, but Katz is beyond that. So was this a conscious effort, or was this simply a reflection of them or you guys?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think, there probably was something about the ways in which we were taught to sort of invent a methodology on our own terms, as opposed to sort of take some, body of theory and bring it somewhere, right? And of course, in both cases, but I mean, Friedrich's narrative style, right? I mean, these stories, right, that were, interwoven with this methodological, analysis, or the historical analysis, without bringing in theory. And I think so, and John's sort of cut to the bone kind of approach, right? To just make the argument, basically. Don't cover it in, extra clothing. What is it you're trying to say? And so, I mean, I think, we did learn. I learned. It's nice to hear you say that, because I would never have thought that there might be a kind of ability for the language to transcend. But I think that we kind of learned to write in a way that was I don't know, parsimonious or certainly clear language to define ourselves clearly. I don't know if other people feel like you still.
I have one comment. I remember in the workshops, Friedrich always asks a small question, He never speaks a lot, but
right.
Only one question,
Right.
And maybe 5 or 6 words, no more than that.
Right. Yeah.
Very directly.
Comments? Questions?
Well, just to follow up on what Cristobal just said, I remember one of the courses with Katz, and I think it was his kind of regional perspectives on the Mexican Revolution, and he came in and sat down and said, "What is a revolution?" No, and everybody, and of course you give that question to graduate students and they run with it, and it was name dropping and theory dropping, and then he would, after everybody meandering for 25 minutes or so, he would say, well, he would answer. Well, revolutions are violent, and he would cut. It was get away. I think so. One of the in answer to kind of this question, I think that we weren't rewarded for name dropping. And kind of collecting theories and putting them together and saying that that's the narrative. And so
Well,
I think that if there's anything that we learned, it's not that you're going to find kind of somebody else's model that you can just apply. And
This may be repeating what people said in the earlier session, but explicitly, there was a real aversion to jargon.
yeah.
Not to theory, but to jargon, and there was a distinction made. So there seemed to be a lot of purchase put on what are the analytical terms of this conversation rather than the semantic terms, whereas by definition, jargon is trading in semantics. But it was, what are you thinking about? How are you thinking about this one?
Kind of related, no. David Collier, who was here at one point in the political science department, and many of us were probably in his class, one day as an assignment, and this is maybe the political science approach, he wanted us as an assignment to read the glossary and learn all the words and learn all the jargon so that we could then have conversations that met like that. And the historians were all very perplexed and puzzled and not pleased by that assignment. So.
Rich Warren, I have an observation about the process, because I think you're asking, how do you get this through process? And I've been thinking a lot about this. One of the things we're talking about here is the level of trust that John and Friedrich created, not only between themselves and their students, but among students. And this is something I think for current graduate students to think about. This is a pretty ambitious group of people in this room. But I don't think most of us thought that we were ever sort of in competition with each other in some kind of a zero-sum game. And so perhaps if there's a style that emerges, it emerges from the fact that, and this gets to actually Dane's question about the quality of grant proposals. We would workshop grant proposals with each other, even if we were applying for the same grants. We read each other's work, and that came from John and Friedrich, that level of trust that we were all invested in something that was not a zero-sum game of our own particular ambitions, but rather we really were committed to doing something that mattered, not just in terms of what it was going to get me, but where we were all kind of going together, even though they were sort of different directions. We were all serving some other purpose than just kind of getting through graduate school. So I think that might be helpful too. So it wasn't about a fad or a fashion, because we'd say, no, that doesn't really work. Try something else.
Chris Boyer. I also think it mattered that we had someone in John who was took a different methodological approach to a lot of the questions that we were answering than the one that we did. You've heard a lot of us this morning said, well, we counted a lot of things. We counted records. I actually remember a practice job talk you gave, I think in this room, in which you presented your quantitative. God, that's weird. But the fact that we did it made us think about, without necessarily having to obsess over method, and how is it that you show something. And I remember that my first seminar paper was some sort of quantitative study of the generals in the Mexican army, which I tried to correlate with the using regression analysis, with the funding for the army, and did that change the number of uprisings? And I think it didn't. But it was experimenting with these other ways of showing historical points that I think really, even though that didn't ever translate into my later work, and many of us I think are in the same, it asked the question of, well, how do you show that? And I really think that that's another reason that allowed us to maybe dispense with some of the hand-wringing that might have happened had we not had that around.
I have to ask Eric a question here about the project and the genesis of the project, the research plan. The book, has come to sort of symbolize to me sort of the perfect marriage of this sort of focus on not necessarily the quantitative, but the business of culture. Marrying these two things that I really did think was a logical project. Outcome of working with John and maybe with Michael Geyer too at the time. But the weird thing about it is I don't remember if that was the plan going down. And you sort of came back and you had all this stuff about the on the business side of the industry. Did you know that you were going to do that going down, or how did that happen?
One thing that I've come to tell other students, grad students, is it doesn't matter what you write, just get the grant. Once you get the grant, you can do whatever you want to do, basically. And because you're absolutely right, yeah, I don't think I had any concept of the business side.
Recording. Hold on a second. That is not school.
And the other thing I want to say is that I remember getting rejected by the SSRC, saying, fascinating proposal, you'll never be able to do this in the time allotted, So, because I think in its proposal, it was, I would have to go back and look at it, but probably conceptually sort of strange and ambitious and whatever, and how was I going to prove it, right? And in doing the research, it was terrible. I remember, I don't think anyone in this room was part of that cohort. There was mostly, there's a colleague, Pat McNamara, who's from Wisconsin, and Glenn Keeker, and they were from Rutgers. There were a few of us, and we would gather together at the Denny's every morning in Mexico City. And they would go trek off to the AGN, or the Porfirio Diaz archive. Like, they were all, they had their place. And I would go, knocking on the doors of the Cámara de Industria, the CIRT, the Radio y Televisión, in suit and tie, trying to get them to give me their archives, Mañana, si vienes mañana te lo tengo. So I was just, I couldn't find documents. I couldn't do it. And Ilan Semo was here, which is another sort of piece of this, perhaps, at least for me. He was in residence here. And he was the one person who really helped to at least validate for me that I was doing something that had meaning in the context of Mexican history, because he was of that generation. And so he was sort of supportive of the project, but he said something that always stuck with me. He said, the problem with rock is it's everywhere and it's nowhere. You're not going to be able to prove it. You're not going to be able to put your finger on it.
Like dust in the wind.
And, between that and sort of John's, insistence, at least, in the, under the toenail kind of way that Paul suggested, of you got to find something. You got to be able to prove something, right? You can't just be in the air. Forced me to really invent a methodology, and figure out what I was, working with very, very scarce, sources. So, I came back and it became a different project. Although I should also add that the dissertation, and this is true, and I also tell my students this is a benefit, the dissertation is not the book. I mean, the book is this radically different dissertation, and it really benefited from outside readers. I was fortunate to have a very, very engaged outside reader who pushed me to think about questions related to gender, for example, and family, which I hadn't thought about, and it really forced me to rethink my conceptualization of what I was trying to say. Why did it matter? What was at stake in this whole process? So, partly, it also, I've always thought about this, that in my case, doing sort of popular culture, urban popular culture, pre-internet, right? I was one of the last of that generation to do research before the internet. And I don't know if that, a blessing or curse. I sort of think of it as a blessing because I was limited in what I could find. I mean, I could not find literally the music or the images. I mean, it was just, I couldn't find the commodity. And which is what led me, in my own methodological argument about the commodity. I couldn't find the commodity, it was gone, right? Now, if you were to do that same project, it's everywhere, right? But it's, on YouTube and it's reissued and blah, blah, blah. I don't think one would have had this, perhaps the same, quandary about the absence or the tenuousness of the commodity in global capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. But I did, because I couldn't find it anywhere. And I remember, writing it up, and in the context of writing up, that's when the internet sort of got invented. It was Jeremy who pushed me. He's like, why aren't you in email? It's like, who needs email? You know, so, but that's an interesting point, because I haven't thought about it, because yeah, it did end up being about business and the business of the commodity, and I probably didn't know that necessarily going in. I was thinking in other terms.
May I ask a question to Professor Gutenberg? I was very impressed as a scholar, as a student who came to the States to study cultural history. The first books I found when I was in graduate school, coming from Mexico in English, was your two first books, and I had the idea that of this internationalism, that this possibility to move outside, because when I came to the States, to going back to what I did of Latin America, I realized I was a Latin American. I only knew that I was not even a Mexican. I was married a Mexican. Then I had to do Latin America, which I did mind, but I wanted to move farther than Latin America. And one of the books that we were assigned to read in those years was your book, and your second book on development.
I thought no one had ever read it.
There's always a first one.
That's the thing with seminars, they force you to do that.
Oh, he didn't say he bought the book. That first sale is gonna happen any minute. Don't worry.
It doesn't show you your account, it's just in the library. But it was very interesting to see that, of course, one of the few books I have read in Mexico who had this breadth was Katz's book on the Secret War. You have all the things happening at the same time, and it's very interesting for me to hear saying this now as a scholar. But I wonder now. I am now a professor here in Chicago, and one of the things, it has become a fashion. You know, our program has international, transnational, and everybody does. So if you were to come with this project now, it's just what we want. But how was it? How was then? Not with Friedrich, with the department, with the university. How was to propose such a plan that you will have to read sources in England and do this and do that, and
in a certain sense, I never really faced that quandary, because we were quite living in our own bubble here. The bubble tended to be John and Friedrich, and they encouraged us, especially Friedrich, to look widely for sources, like as everyone here has been saying. I think that the kind of methodological preference for looking for kind of transnational social processes came about more unconsciously from his pushing and some pushing from John as well. So I don't ever remember that being an obstacle. It was just something that you were supposed to do a lot of research. And a lot of research at that time, maybe what Eric is saying is correct, meant going to a lot of places. And when you went to a lot of places to look at archives, maybe not as many as Friedrich Katz did, he would go to 60 places. I would go to 6. But prior to the internet, you actually had to travel places to, find this obscure document about this, and then the process begins. Well, how do I fit in an active way rather than just a representational way, the British role in this process, or the German interaction with Peruvian scientists and this and that. So there was no obstacle to it, and we were just encouraged to do that kind of thing, except for those people who were working in their small little peasant rebellion in this little tiny corner of Mexico. Like Peter.
That's tomorrow.
That's
tomorrow now.
So I had to say that.
Well, first of all, a lot of what I'm hearing, I can't remember the expression, but there's something along the lines of if you're never hyper fashionable, you're never out of fashion. I mean, Friedrich didn't care about currents and jargon and things like that.
Or the way you dress.
No, I wasn't there. But it was interesting because I gave to one of my grad students who's going to work on World War I, John, your very nice biography, your synopsis, your very touching piece about Friedrich. And this very smart grad student read it and said, that is so intimidating. Because to be a good historian like Friedrich Katz, you need to speak, what, 5 languages by the time you're 20. You need to be so worldly. How could any of you pretended to have gotten there? And I said, none of us pretended. There was no way. It was, I mean, there wasn't this sort of intimidation, first of all, some gentle sharing soul, yet at the same time, this incredible international knowledge. It was very interesting, because she really took it as, that would be a very hard person to work with, and I had to explain and stress what also was in that text by John about these sort of human qualities that allowed us to realize we were doing a fraction of what he would have done with this project. We were, you know, Paul went to 6 rather than 60 archives, but it's a very interesting discussion about that.
Just a simple anecdote, just to tell you this to my graduate students today. This morning I have a conversation with one of my graduate students who should remain nameless. He was complaining that why we didn't force them to learn 5 languages. But we should force them to learn 5 languages. I say, you know, your colleagues will not, your peers will not love you.
I think that it was simply normal. I think the question would have been then, why don't you do that? How was it? But it was just assumed and normal that everybody did that. And then for me, then there are 2 other resources. One is a telephone at 9 o'clock. You called Professor Katz to make sure you would meet him later. Without that telephone, nothing would take place. And then you got, you know, superb advice, and the always would take place. And then now I do economics, but then I didn't do economics. But I think John was as critical in this. For me, he provided the infrastructure, and he would go and hammer these reviews out of these letters of recommendation. He could, I said I needed that, and then he's and I was like, oh my goodness, how can he do that so fast? He doesn't really. So those 2 were together. That was one process and 2 axles, or one car with 2 axles. So
Yes, Carol?
I just wanted to say that it seems to me that there is a certain sense, of course the Katzworth years were exceptional because, you know, 2 great talents met here in Chicago, of course, but it seems that there's also something about like the milieu or the conditions of possibility for these 2 talents to really produce what they produced. And I was thinking, if, you know, I don't know, in 10, 20 or any number of years, somebody sat down and said, well, I'm gonna write a history about this, I don't know, 3, 4 generations of historians in Chicago. Of course, I mean, the personal traits and the intellectual force of Friedrich Katz and John Coatsworth would be like, you know, 2 of the engines driving this. And of course, the individual talents of each of the individuals involved too. But there seems to me that there has to be something more that maybe, you know, as participants, you're still not completely aware of about, you know, what allowed this to happen in a university. I mean, what was going on? I mean, you've talked, of course, about the political context and, you know, each of your interests and all, but what was going on in the University of Chicago as an institution that allowed this to happen?
Or in spite of.
Yeah. Or maybe the other way around. Yeah, of course.
I can offer an answer from somebody who wasn't here.
You weren't here.
And so therefore could see therefore could see it from the outside and could see things that were maybe obvious to many of you because you had it. And we didn't have it. I mean, you've named a number of them, and people now who've gone to other jobs know that this was true then, it's true now. Interdisciplinarity was real and possible and easy here. It was not in other places. I count my own graduate school then and now as being in that category where it's really a struggle and not encouraged.
Name your institution, don't you?
They everywhere. But the thing that I wanted to highlight, and maybe this is something that will come up more tomorrow, but I wanted to put it on the table and Carlos gave me the opening to that, is there is something then about the community of graduate students. I mean, speaking from somebody who did his PhD virtually alone, with a very good mentor and so on and so forth, but alone. And when I looked at Chicago, what I saw, even then when I was a graduate student, was, and I didn't even know that you have workshops and seminars, all these things that I never had. Never. And I mean never. Okay, because when you're the only one you talk to is a professor. Now, I happen to have a very good professor, but still, it's never the same thing. So I want to bring up that dimension of the rest of you, of the community. And you can see that in your books, in the acknowledgements. Not just the usual, my colleagues in graduate school, the ones I got drunk with, and the ones, no, that's normal. I mean, real intellectual influence, right? I think that's something that needs to be brought up in the table. And actually, as somebody was saying, I think, remarkably, in a context where Chicago graduate studies were not what they are today. I mean, you wouldn't, I mean, this was a time of the unfunded PhD, of the fellowship that switched from year to year, of the insecurity. When somebody said, one of you, the early panel, that, Chuck maybe, the 3 hamburgers you get at the end of the year. Well, I say this to our students now because they get too many hamburgers now, not too few. Every student is fully funded, and so it's a different setting, and it makes it more remarkable, therefore, this issue of camaraderie, of not competition, when the stakes were higher in competing, when everybody has a full fellowship. Well, you can afford to be generous because nothing happens. But when resources are scarce, that is more remarkable, and that always struck me. I just say this maybe so you who were here can reflect on it as something extraordinary. So interdisciplinarity, that issue of collegiality, camaraderie, and intellectual influence, learning from each other, not just reading, but learning, and discussing and debating. And the third thing, which was mentioned before also, which was absent, certainly where I did my PhD, and I think in most other places then, was really this issue that John and Friedrich were really at the forefront of, and we've tried to follow since, of this kind of international community of scholars being involved in. I mean, you mentioned Ilan Semo, somebody mentioned, the fact that Chicago was always a place where people were coming through. Friedrich's friends, John friends, the whole sort of Mexican intellectual left at some point or another, when it was not so fashionable to be leftist in Mexico, sort of made it through Chicago, when it was, you sort of tell about Adolfo Gili, but Adolfo Gili, now he's an elderly sort of intellectual, but at that time it was a much more controversial thing. And as Friedrich would say, the Mexican consulate wasn't always happy when these characters were landing at the University of Chicago with that. And so I'm just throwing it out there as an outsider, because maybe you can reflect on it and follow up on what Carlos was saying.
We were waiting for the pig to die. We were wondering what's going to happen with.
Well, I remember when Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas came and filled the auditorium in that moment. Yeah. And he already came back.
Came back. I want to just reinforce a couple of things Emilio said. One about the intellectual community of graduate students. One of the things that was really remarkable here, and it's hard to replicate elsewhere, and I really try a lot, is not only the community of students who are in a given year, who arrive at the same time, but a continuity of community where you're coming in and, one way or another, you meet Paul Gutenberg. In my case, I met him pretty early. And somehow there's this, you know the people after you, and you know the people before you. So when you're getting ready to do grant proposals, there's a wealth of knowledge you can draw on in the graduate student community about when the deadlines are and this and that and the other thing, and how you do it, and which ones are hard to get, which ones are easy to get. That's really very remarkable. I hope it still continues. Okay. The other thing I want to say about the question of the internationalization, one thing that this place, had from the moment that I arrived on campus, which was a long, long time ago, it was the Tinker program. Mm-hmm. The ability to fund these international scholars, going way back. Okay, the first ones I remember were like Enrique Samuel. Enrique Samuel was here on a Tinker, going. I feel like I had John Friedrich and then a succession of these international scholars who I took courses with, or I didn't take courses with, but I got a chance to hang out with and talk to. That's the key institutional support that they had here. That it's so hard to get somewhere else. And I want to just throw in a plug for the Tinker.
There was always a Tinker.
There was always a Tinker. I don't know how they got the Tinker money
30
originally.
years, I don't know either. I just distributed the money. 100 and something scholars.
I know how.
Good.
I got a terrifying telephone call from Hannah Gray one day to say that the Tinker Foundation might be interested in contributing something to the university. And would I be willing to fly to New York with the vice president, whose name I don't remember, to meet with Martha Muse, the president of the foundation? So we did. Martha was a terrifying person. She more or less outlined the grant proposal that I had to write, made it clear to me that if I did anything else, we probably wouldn't get the money, and my career would be over. So I came back and worked very hard and wrote a proposal and sent it in. And when the Tinker Foundation decided to give us the endowment, I thought, wow, ain't I great? And then I realized that the only university represented on the Tinker Foundation's board of directors that had not yet received a Tinker professorship was Chicago. So you can develop your own explanation.
There are grants that are easy to get.
Thinking around the different communities of scholars that came in to stay here for a while. There were people from France, there were people from Germany, from Austria. We have one here now. And I think that too helped create an interesting and variable environment. You had people, a lot of the scholars whom I really got to know better when I went to the memorial services for my dad in Berlin and in Vienna. They all knew each other, and many of them had come through here. Many of them had spent some time in Chicago. And so I think along with all the scholars from Mexico, that helped create a kind of comparative perspective for many of the questions that people were examining, even that is Latin Americanists talking about ways in which Latin American history was being written about in Germany or in Austria or in France. And then I also know that my dad had a lot of interest in speaking with François Furet, who came here a lot. And so I think from the comparative revolutions angle, that might have created some ferment.
All these professors from all the parties, Hebrew, expert on Hebrew literature, an expert on Africa, and he will start speaking then with German. Oh no, because we are in a discussion about what's going to happen with Israel, and with this other, we are talking about, Africa, and he was always involved in some other.
Yes, I want to go back to Emilio's point, and also yours, Mauricio, about the nature of the grad cohort here. And this might invoke John. I think size matters. We had a very critical size. My entry class maybe about 7, so it's big. And then, but I remember also the first year I was here at the seminar, that was with John. It was very intimidating to have someone like Peter and Paul Liffman and all these other people also participating in the seminar, which means these were big seminars, which also I think allowed us to be pretty separate from the rest of the history department. Their offices was down in the basement, and I played soccer, and so I got to know historians from other fields, Europe and US, and I was struck by how separate, intellectually speaking, we were from the rest of them. Even though we got to know some people, Hannah Rosen, for example, in US history, but that was not necessary. I mean, it was different somehow. We were, I think, seen as a separate group, which I think also allowed us to forge more interdisciplinary links with Latin Americans from other departments. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I think what really brought us together were the kind of questions we were interested in. And that goes back to your question about the writing, because ultimately the questions we had were not disciplinary, were not methodological. They were ultimately, I think for many of us, they were political. And we tackled them in different ways. And going back to the Tinker point, that was very important. And it was also very important that they were not all from Mexico. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking also of the graduate students. Here's Cristobal, Peru, Ivan from Peru, Carlos Espinosa from Ecuador, and goes back to Mauricio's.
That's over.
Well, this is a new century. But it struck me, it was their experience too. I was struck by, I was coming from Switzerland, I didn't know anything about Latin America. Well, Cristobal also said he knew very little about Latin America. He learned
even less about Switzerland.
I don't remember.
I remember, because, and it was to come, in part it has to do also with the material realities in Latin America. It's very hard to read a book on, let's say, on Nicaragua in Bolivia, but here you have this wonderful library. And then you also have ILL, which already functioned then. And the other thing is we were always very international, transnational before probably the term became fashionable. I mean, when you teach Latin American history, you know, by definition, you're sort of a bit transnational. Whereas the others, I felt, the other areas in the history department were not at all interested in these kind of issues. I thought they were very parochial compared to us. I mean, I think in many ways they found it very daunting, you know, what are you going to teach a course on Latin America? What do you know about Argentina? What do you know, on the Central Americans? What do you know of Mexico? I think it was that kind of transnational internationalism that was on one hand politically driven, but I think also on the other hand, it was grounded in the kind of community we were able to create, whereas I think the others were not able to do that. I don't know what it's like now.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, I completely agree with you, but I think there was also a balance in the sense that we had this big cohort, and it was really the Latin American history community, but for the oral exams that you had to do as a history student, you were required to do either something in another discipline or in another world region. And I can say, I mean, that is not true at all of all history programs in this country. It's not true at a lot of history programs in this country. And so you had the sort of institutional support and encouragement to really look outside. And I think one of the wonderful things about it is that you had a choice also, because you could sort of further push that interdisciplinarity, or you could further push the comparative historical part, and some people did both, or all at the same time. But I think that's something that, I don't know if it's still true today here at Chicago, but that was very big part of what we were asked to do.
I mean, also my recollection is that like the theories of the transnational were coming in. At least this is how I was influenced. Like Nestor Garcia Conclini was just probably, and Apatarai was. So there was like this stuff coming out from other kind of quarters to sort of think about this term.
But that was not in Professor Gutenberg's time.
No, but he was like my dad or something. No, I was here like late '80s, you know, at this moment. I mean, you were doing it right in your own. You were doing it much more of a.
You hired your son, Dr. Freud, please.
Just like Italian academia.
I mean, I guess I remember trying to put history to the theory. In a sense, I mean, try to figure out what do we do with this. It's in my case. I mean, trying to make sense of these terms, hybridity, whatever. What is that, right? How do we make sense of that in an historical way? But
I think we have to stop it there.
You wanted to make one last comment?
I just want to actually shift the conversation a little bit, because I think there's a dark side to all of this reminiscing that we need to be fully cognizant of, and that is that this was the end, the shadow of the Cold War. The very idea of Latin America was shaped by the U.S. government's desire to respond to the Cuban Revolution. I work in a place that founded its Latin American Studies program in 1960 with money from the State Department going to a good Jesuit university that would train people to fight the Cold War. A lot of the funding for us to go and do our PhDs and to go and do our dissertation research was funded by the Cold War. A lot of our motivations to be in graduate school were in opposition to U.S. policy. At least I'm speaking from my own personal experience. That's how my understanding of Latin America was shaped. So, but there's as much as this was kind of a great time that we were able to have 7 or 8 people start graduate school at the same time to study Latin America, there's a broader context that is completely blown out of the water. The upside is, I think that we're experiencing now a questioning of what exactly is Latin America, right? I mean, that's certainly the conversation that I'm having at LASA is, are we defining it in terms of a particular political space? Are we defining it in terms of where cultural groups are? How are we talking about these issues? And that's something that I think we don't want to lose sight of, and get too nostalgic for a time that was really horrific for people living in Latin America, right? Which is what motivated us many of us to sort of focus our attentions on this.